Welcome back to the podcast, Unbinding the Bible. This is episode 177, A House Built on the Rock. And on the podcast this week, I would like us to look at Matthew 7, 24 to 27 together as we kind of hear Jesus' words in wrapping up his Sermon on the Mount. So next episode will be the last episode in the Sermon on the Mount series, as it is sort of Matthew's summary statement of how the crowds and the disciples received Jesus' teaching and how they recognized his authority when he did so. But here we're going to round out and finish Jesus' words himself in what he delivers in the sermon. And I'm really looking forward to this episode. I hope it will be encouraging to you, and I hope our time through the Sermon on the Mount has been encouraging to you. I have a few ideas of where I'd like to go when the Sermon on the Mount is finished, and I wasn't always sure, even leading right up until today, where we might go next, but I've got a few ideas. I'm going to hold those to myself for the time being, but I think that it will be a great time moving forward together as we continue to grow and learn together. So without any more of an introduction, let's just get right into it. As we begin this week's episode, allow me just to read Matthew 7, 24 through 27. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Now that's the only words we're going to look at this week on the podcast. As I said in the introduction, this is the conclusion of what Jesus has to teach, as Matthew has summed it up for us in the Sermon on the Mount. And as I've done in past weeks, and I don't apologize for, I am using Skye Jitani's book again for this week's episode, What If Jesus Was Serious? I have a few things from Skye that I want to pull out of his book, and then I have a few illustrations of my own, which I think will help us to bring this full circle so that we make sure we understand it. In the first chapter that Skye has in his book, where he talks about the rock, and he talks about this passage, he has a little illustration, and he basically writes out, what does the rock represent, right? We're dealing here with a wise man who built his house on a rock and a foolish man who built his house on sand. And I think it would do us a lot of good if we came to the right conclusions. And Skye has similar church experiences as I do, and maybe you as well. And so he lists a few of the things that he's been taught throughout his life regarding what the rock represents. And he writes there, for the intellectual answer, Christian theology represents the rock. So here we are building our house on this good, solid Christian theology. Or the institutional answer might be the rock is the church, right? You know, of course, Jesus says to Peter later on in the book of Matthew that on this rock I will build my church, right? So there's some connection there between church and the rock itself. But then the Sunday school answer, of course, being Jesus. That's obviously the Sunday school answer for every question, right? Jokingly, people share that. And does Jesus refer to himself as the rock? Well, we're going to get into that in just a second. But the correct answer, based upon the passage itself, is actually none of those things. It's not Christian theology, it's not the church, and it's not even Jesus. The correct answer is obedience to Jesus's commands. Now, I have shared this before on the podcast, and I've grew up in a particular context which taught more or less that wasn't the case. For some reason, the teaching I received growing up focused so much on it being not Catholic, and a lot of the time it was spoken about as being not Catholic. And in that view, a very, very shallow, non-understanding view would just label Catholicism as the religion that teaches works-based salvation. And I really dislike terms like that because they are very unclear what they mean by that when they denigrate like all of Catholicism under the heading of works-based, but it also doesn't clarify what faith-based means. Like, it doesn't address a passage like this one, which quite literally says, whoever hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And then Jesus contrasts that with whoever hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And so, it's interesting because we are familiar with this passage. It's a really easy image to picture. You can imagine children's Sunday school curriculum being filled with this kind of image. Here's house, here's rock, here's a sand. And, we can play with it with little sand or rocks or whatever we have in our Sunday school room for a visual aid. And yet, it's oftentimes those of us most familiar with this passage who are the ones who actually misread what Jesus is saying. Skye goes on to say in his chapter that as a kid, he was told that the man who built his house on the rock was a metaphor for a Christian, and the foolish man was a metaphor for a non-Christian. But if you just read what Jesus says, that's not at all what he's talking about. He is not comparing Christians and non-Christians. He's actually contrasting two kinds of Christians, the genuine one and the false one. And I hope at this point in the sermon, you've seen this happen time and time again. At least that's been the way I've intended to teach it, or at least talk through it on the podcast, is recognizing all of the subtle ways that we can get in trouble with some misreadings. But I don't want us to do that here. Jesus is very clear. Whoever hears these words of mine and does them, right, listens to them, embraces and internalizes and lives out my teaching on prayer, on fasting, on giving, on being the light, on recognizing internal character as what is the most important, of being just as quick, if not quicker, to judge your own impure motives in your actions toward others as you are in judging the actions of others. In fact, Jesus says, don't even judge the actions of others at all, right? Turning the other cheek, going an extra mile, loving your enemies, actively praying for their blessing and flourishing in this life, seeking love from the heart, being what it is that changes the lives of the people around you who don't care for you at all. Looking at your own internal heart and its lustful desires, whether that be heterosexual lust or homosexual lust, and being as eager, if not more eager, to critique what's in your own heart and in the hearts of the other Christians around you as you are to, quote unquote, critique or condemn the actions of those outside the church. Judgment begins with the household of God, Peter reminds us in 1 Peter 4, and Jesus would wholeheartedly agree, which is why he speaks the way he does to his own disciples in such blatant and blunt terms. What Jesus is describing in this passage as he wraps up the Sermon on the Mount is that these two houses, one built on the rock and one built on the sand, appear to be the exact same. On the outside, they look the same. The only difference lies in the foundation of each one. And foundations, as most of you probably know, are under the surface of the ground. Now, the only time the foundation is exposed as being either weak or strong is when the elements, if you will, right? Here, the rain or the wind blowing or the floods rising. The only time these elements come or when they enter the scene is the only time that the foundation is shown to be either weak or strong. So what we now as hearers and doers of Jesus' word then, what we are made of, what is actually under the surface, will determine whether we stand or fall. Now, it's important to think about it like this because the Bible has a lot to say about the circumstances that one enters, or the difficulty, or trials, or tribulations, or challenges, or the enemies that surround you. And our response to those things says a lot more about us than it does about those things. And so the idea isn't that God would rid the world of all of the bad that gets in our way. No, rather, we want to be rid of what it is in us that causes us to respond so wrongfully toward the difficulties and the circumstances and the tribulations that are going on outside of us. In other words, we want him to address what is actually under the surface in us so that we will be free to endure whatever it is that comes our way. This is one of the primary points of sanctification in the Christian life, growth as a Christian. It's not about amassing new bits of theological information. It's not about attending more church services. It's not about reading more of the Bible or memorizing more of the Bible. All of those things are perfectly fine. But those things can all happen and happen a lot, and you be unchanged on the inside. What Jesus is concerned about, as he said in Matthew 23, clean the inside of the cup and the outside will also be clean. What Jesus is ultimately after here is people who listen to what he's said and act on it. Acting on what Jesus says is the actual evidence that you believe what Jesus has said. So even in a world like I grew up in, which wanted to make these really harsh distinctions, where you're saved by faith, you're saved by works, I get what people are saying. But the trouble about that language is that you make a false divide. You assume that there's nothing for you to do as a Christian if it's just by faith. But you also make a false divide in concluding that people who do things out of obedience for God are somehow thinking to themselves that by doing these things, they are earning their salvation. Well, that's ridiculous. There's no earning of my salvation. Jesus is inviting me into the way of life. And I'm sorry, but the way of life actually involves living. It actually involves doing. It involves activity. It involves participation. Invite someone into a way of life and tell them to do nothing. They're like, what a boring life, right? When you're sick, or if any of you had COVID over the past couple of years and your body seems to be shutting down and you just lay in your bed and you just sleep all the time, it's drudgery. It's like a despicable existence. What's the point of that? There is no point. Jesus isn't inviting us into eternal life in that we need to be saved so we go to heaven when we die. Jesus is inviting us into life. And to be invited into life means to trust him with our life, trust him with the way he's told us to treat our enemies, trust him with the deep, dark, hidden away secrets in our souls that we don't trust anyone with, and sometimes not even ourselves. Trust me when I tell you to go the extra mile. Trust me when I tell you that it's the meek that are going to inherit the earth, not the proud or the courageous or the bold. Trust me when I say the poor in spirit, the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Trust me. And the only way to trust someone who's saying things that don't seem to make much sense is to actually put what he says into action, into practice. And so he's identifying the fact that when difficult times come, when an enemy comes, that's the only opportunity that you and I have to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. If we have no one in our life who is opposing us, we have no opportunity to put that command into action. So when those enemies present themselves, we could, as many Christians do, try to pray away that difficulty or that persecution, that God would relieve us from the pressures that we feel we are under. Or we could pray that he would grant us the grace and the strength to withstand those pressures and be transformed by that external circumstance. One of two ways we can choose to pray. One of two ways we can choose to act. But based upon how we are thinking he's choosing to work in our lives will shape the way it takes place. And so Jesus has taught us, and he's teaching us here, that what's below the surface will show itself when the external elements present themselves. And this is unavoidable. We will face this every single day of our lives. It was probably 15 years now, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not exactly sure on my timeline, but I think it was about 15 years ago, maybe more. But I was working at a Christian camp. I wasn't working there at the time. I was working there at the time. So it's been more than 15 years. I'm sorry, it's been almost 20. Good grief. But I was leading a weekend retreat for a bunch of high schoolers in the middle of February. And the weather forecast for that weekend was getting worse by the day. And by Friday, when the campers were to arrive with their counselors and sponsors, it was to be a pretty nasty ice storm. And most of the attenders made it, about 250 teenagers. And then the ice really began to come down. It was in southern Ohio. There's sort of a band there geographically where they're kind of between snow more to the north and rain more to the south. And so right in that band of space, they oftentimes would get a mixture. So the sleet, the freezing rain, whatever. And that's what we got on this particular weekend. And to make a long story short, it sleeted and sleeted and sleeted for hours on end. And way late into the night Friday, it had been doing it for so many hours that the ice was just accumulating on all the branches. It was wet enough to come down as rain, but as soon as it hit the ground or the trees, it just froze into sheets of ice, and there was ice everywhere. And I remember herding all the campers into a special place to keep them safe because we were genuinely concerned for people. And branches were falling off of trees, broke a couple windshields of some of the church vans. And it was kind of a little bit of a scary day. But what I noticed was the weight of this ice began to accumulate on top of the branches. And what trees didn't have branches snap off just began to bend. They just began to bend under the weight. I mean, so much ice was on the end of these trees, and a lot of pine trees around the area were particularly susceptible. All their branches on the top, as you can picture a pine tree, just began to be totally covered in ice and began to sag. Well, my another person who worked on the staff at the time, he and I went out just kind of walking around just to see what was going on, and we would hear these cracks every 15 or 20 seconds. And then we'd hear a big thud on the ground. And it didn't take us long to discover that what we were hearing literally every 15 to 20 seconds was a pine tree just falling over, collapsing under the weight of this tremendous ice, right? These elements. And we actually had to get out of the way of one. One fell in our general vicinity, and I remember running backwards. I don't know if it would have hit me, but these are 40 to 50 feet tall pine trees, and I didn't have an exact idea of how tall they were in relation to how far away I was horizontally from its base, but they were falling at a rapid rate. And by the end of the weekend, we estimated that on the properties of the camp, we lost somewhere around 1,500 pine trees. And one of the things you notice about pine trees, first of all, they're beautiful, they're tall, they're straight, they're strong, they'll kind of sway in the wind. But when a pine tree falls over, doesn't crack in the middle like it falls over, like the whole thing falls over. It actually was uprooted. And one of the strangest things about these pine trees, to me, who never really paid much attention to trees, was that a 40 to 50 foot pine tree had about a 4-foot deep root system. And when these pine trees uprooted, they uprooted the ground and the roots just came right with them and just laid right there on the top of the ground. And you look at the proportions of that pine tree versus what it had under the surface, and it's no wonder that 1,500 of them fell over. They had huge trees evident to the outside eye, but super short and shallow root systems under the ground. And when the elements, in this case, freezing rain, right? Jesus just talks about rain and the floods and the winds, but we had freezing rain and some wind. And when those elements came, what was under the surface made all the difference. And what was under the surface was too weak to sustain those kinds of elements. And this is what Jesus is getting at, especially as he's teaching us this Sermon on the Mount, as he is talking about all of the internal realities, all of the hidden righteousness, all of the secret motivations, all of the character development, all of the ways we are tempted to judge other people and justify our failure to love them under the heading that they have bad theology. Whatever it happens to be for us as Christians, there is no escaping when Jesus gives the teaching that he gives. He is turning over every stone. He is looking around every corner. No one escapes the words that he speaks. What he is ultimately after is allowing us to open ourselves up to him at such a deep level that he transforms us entirely from the inside out and begins that work and continues that work until it's over so that we can withstand anything that comes our way. Jesus, of course, being the ultimate example. And so I just want to bring to your attention a passage from Proverbs chapter 9. Actually, it's the entire chapter 9 of Proverbs. Many of you may know Proverbs speaks a lot about wise and foolish people. And I don't think that Jesus is making this up when he starts talking about a wise man and a foolish man. This is just Proverbs language. This is just wisdom language, as it's often referred to throughout the Old Testament. But Proverbs 9 is unique, and it's unique for a couple of reasons. And I just want to read to you the way that Proverbs talks about wisdom. And it talks about houses, okay? So it's going to personify wisdom, which just means it's going to speak about wisdom as if wisdom was a woman calling to you to listen to her and then inviting you into her house to have a meal with her. And then in the same chapter, it is going to refer to folly or foolishness, also as a woman who is inviting you to come in and have a meal at her house. And I want you to listen. You'll hear some repetition. I wish I could show you visually what I've done in my notes visually, but you'll hear some repetition and you'll hear some things that happen in between these two descriptions, which is really the thrust of the passage. And I'll do my best to just verbally communicate that to you. So if you just listen, I'm going to read. It's 18 verses long. It won't take me too long, but I do think this is really instructive for us to think through what Jesus is talking about. So here it is, Proverbs 9, verse 1. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her young women to call from the highest places in the town. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. To him who lacks sense, she says, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live, and walk in the way of insight. Whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse, and he who reproves a wicked man incurs injury. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. For by me your days will be multiplied, and years will be added to your life. If you are wise for yourself. If you scoff, you alone will bear it. The woman folly is loud. She is seductive and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house. She takes a seat on the highest places of the town, calling to those who pass by, who are going straight on their way. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks sense, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. Now, hopefully you heard the repetition. I think I may have been able to make that a little clearer, but in verse 4 that I read, where the woman, wisdom, is saying, whoever is simple, let him turn in here. To him who lacks sense, she says. And also in verse 16, in speaking about the woman folly, she says, whoever is simple, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks sense, she says. And then both of them are talking about eating of the drinks that she has. The woman folly is talking about stolen water and bread eaten in secret being pleasant. Woman, the wisdom talks about come eating of her bread and drink of the wine that she has mixed. And so they both are sitting at the seat at the door of their houses, and they're calling out to those who are walking by. This is the picture that Proverbs uses in personifying wisdom, making wisdom this idea as if it was a person, right? That's all personification means, and the Bible is filled with this kind of language. This is what Jesus is doing. Whoever is wise hears my words and does them. That's a person who is wise, right? So that's a person who opens the door to Lady Wisdom or Lady Folly is the one who is a foolish one. But in this passage, the first several verses talk about wisdom. The last several verses talk about folly. And in the middle is this double call, leave your simple ways and live, and walk in the way of insight. And then in verses 7, 8, and 9, which really are in the center of this 18-verse section, there's a really cool little play on words. It talks about scoffers, wicked men, wise men, and righteous men. And it does so in a pattern. And so it says, whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse. He who reproves a wicked man incurs injury. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning. Now, just in the way you listen to me read it again, verse 7 talks about a scoffer, then a wicked man. Verse 8, the first half of it talks about a scoffer again and him hating you. You're going to get abuse if you try to correct somebody who is a fool, more or less. But then verse 8 pivots and it says, reprove a wise man and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man, right? Well, a wise man is wise. He doesn't need instruction. No, the wise person who is wise knows that he doesn't know everything there is to know and has much more still to learn. He then goes on in verse 9 and says, teach a righteous man and he will increase in learning. So what's really interesting about this pursuit of wisdom and this pursuit of folly, and this is the reason why I wanted to read for you Proverbs chapter 9, is because in the heart of this passage, and this is important for the way biblical writers, particularly in the Old Testament, would write, they would do what is called a chiastic structure. They would write in such a way that some idea would be mentioned once and then repeated, then an idea would be mentioned again and then repeated again. And if you follow the flow of the narrative, it forms, the reason it's called a chiasm is from the Greek word chi, which is chi, but it just was the Greek letter X in our understanding about what that would look like visually, which means there's an element, if you look at an X and think about it, this top left to the bottom right and then top right to bottom left, it forms an X, right? Well, if you look at half the X, it's like you've got these mirroring images which then intersect in the very center. And so you have a point at the top and a point at the bottom, and then the closer you get to the middle, the points get closer together, if that makes any sense. And what you have in Proverbs 9 is one of these structures, and right in the center, right after listening to an invitation by Lady Wisdom and an invitation at the end by Lady Folly, what you have sandwiched in the middle of those things is the thrust of what's going on in that chapter. And what that means for us is one of the biggest indicators that someone is wise is that they are willing and open to receive correction, reproof, instruction, and teaching. People who are wise do not view themselves as those who already know the answers. The wise among us are those who realize there is always more to learn. The wise, according to Proverbs and according to Jesus, are the humble among us. who do not think of themselves more highly than they ought, but rather think of themselves with sober judgment, as Paul reminds us in Romans chapter 12. The scoffer, the wicked man, is someone who already believes himself or herself to know what is right and will argue with you if you attempt to correct them, point out things in their life that are not what they should be, or offer a different way of looking at a scenario which they are quite convinced they already have thought through perfectly well to that point already. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because it has actually proven to be somewhat troublesome for me, primarily in my own life, when I came to the conclusion that deep down in my own heart, right? So what is under the surface? What is the foundation that I'm building on? If the foundation I'm building on is this idea that my identity needs to be rooted in someone who is always right, or who already knows the answer, or who genuinely or generally does the right things all the time, then when I'm corrected, when I am rebuked, when I'm reproved, when I'm told that a decision I made or an action I took or a thing that I said was foolish or unwise, and I take offense at that, instead of taking a step back and saying, oh, is there something new I can learn about this here? Does this person who's offering me this reproof have some insight that maybe my life would be made better if I took that insight and applied it in my own life? I have found over the years that I am a huge fool in the way that I fight against receiving correction. I fight against it. I don't like being reproved. I don't like being corrected. I want to get upset at the person who reproves me and get argumentative about the way they chose to do it, or you didn't treat me nicely enough. You didn't bring it to my attention in a way that I was actually able to hear it, instead of realizing that according to Proverbs, reproving a wise man will cause him to love you. Because a wise man is interested in pursuing wisdom. He's not interested in being proven right. A wise man is interested in receiving instruction because he wants to be wiser still. He doesn't want to be thought of as already wise. You see, it's easy to get caught up in this idea that you are either wise or you're a fool. A wise person doesn't look at himself that way. A wise person says there is always more wisdom to be obtained. Any way that I can come by that wisdom is a gift to me. And I love the person or the people or the sets of circumstances that bring my folly to my attention so that I might gain wisdom. Teach a righteous man, Solomon goes on to say, and he will increase in learning. This is another part about being righteous. There is always more to increase in your learning, in your righteousness, and in your life. And so what Jesus is getting at, and what I think Proverbs 9 is getting at, is taking one giant stab at attempting to convince us about what it means to be wise or what it means to be foolish. And this is why it's so destructive in my mind when Christian teachers say that to build your house on the rock means you trust in Jesus. Because what this does and has the potential to do is to get Christians to start now seeing themselves as the wise people. They now start to see themselves as the wise people and those who are not Christians as the foolish people. And now the Christians who build their identity upon viewing themselves as actually wise for having believed in Jesus are much less open to receiving rebuke, to being shown that they are wrong, or to being shown that they need some serious correction. And this shows up in individual lives. It shows up in marriages. It shows up in relationships between parents and kids. And I'm only speaking from personal experience when I say it shows up in all of these places, because it has shown up these ways in my life. And this also shows up in institutional ways and in society. We are right now finding that these great divisions that we are facing in our culture is largely owed to the fact that when one group brings an alternative perspective on something to another group who believes their perspective is the only one that's real and that they already know, the history of the American people, or they already know the way racism affects black people, even though they're a white person, or they already know how a woman experiences oppression in the workplace, even though they're a man, or they already know how sexual dysfunction in our culture actually makes people who are confused about their gender, how they actually feel, even though they have personally never dealt with anything like this in their own lives. I'm watching this happen in the church and outside the church when people get very upset very fast. Let me give you an example. Oh, well, we're just going through this incredibly difficult, historical rewrite. People are now demonizing Christopher Columbus, and they're telling us that the history that we were taught in school is not true, and we need to have the history rewritten. And instead of engaging this as an opportunity to learn, right, as an opportunity to grow in wisdom, let me listen. Let me list off for you how Jesus says wise people respond to reproof, instruction, and being taught new things. Ready? Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning. Now, this is Proverbs' definition of what a wise person does. This is Proverbs' way of saying, you now, if this is your stance and this is your posture, you have accepted Lady Wisdom's invitation to come and dine with her, and it will make your life more rich and more fulfilling. Being invited into Lady Wisdom's home is described with the word scoffer and wicked man. And listen to what it says. Whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse. He who reproves a wicked man incurs injury. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Now, I've watched this happen, and I'm not speaking to our culture because I assume no one outside the church, or at least those who are sensitive to what Christians who are in churches believe and think about, I'm assuming none of those people listen to this podcast. I may be wrong, and that would be a happy time in my life to be wrong. I would love it if someone who didn't identify as a Christian found themselves listening here. If that's you and you're listening, I'm so glad, and I hope that this is helpful for you. But for the majority of you who are Christians, I'm talking to you. And what I want to say to you is before you reject outright something that is new to you, something that is different to you, something where someone is reproving you because they think your view or your actions or your belief is limited in some way and needs enlarged, right? I'm not sure all the reasons why a person might reprove you, but listen to the way it words again. I got to keep going over this because there's just no escaping this for me or for anyone else. Reprove a wise man and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man and he will increase in learning. So the church really should be the kind of place where we grow more and more comfortable admitting we need to be taught things, admitting that there might be a different perspective to something that we've thought for so long that we don't. And what I've noticed is that there's generally a defensive posture, a little bit of a doubling down on what we already think. And then there is this major temptation to just write off that person or that group or that thought so that we don't have to deal with it. We don't want to bring it into our thinking because to do so is unsettling for some people. And so they'd rather not think about it. They'd rather just have this be a sealed deal. In other words, what they're tempted to do is define their wisdom, quote unquote, as we have the right answer, which is the opposite of what Jesus says wisdom is. And it's the opposite of what Proverbs says wisdom is. Proverbs says wisdom is the openness and the knowledge that you're after more wisdom. You want to increase in learning. You want to be wiser than you are right now, tomorrow. And you want to love the people that point out to you the things about your life that aren't what they should be so that your life can get better. This is ultimately what it's for. But if you just demonize everything that's opposed to what you naturally think, then you never have the opportunity to do that. Now, I'm not saying anything that a person says to you, you have to believe it and accept it and embrace it. That's not what I'm saying at all. Wise people, though, think through these issues. Because part of coming to a conclusion about a particular topic, if you will, inevitably involves putting yourself in those people's place. Wise people do this. They imagine what it would be like to be in someone else's shoes. This, I think, is woefully lacking today. And this comes right out of the Sermon on the Mount. If you remember the way I connected the first several verses of Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says not to judge. He then says, don't throw your pearls before swine, or they're going to turn and tear you to pieces. And so I pose the question, well, if I'm not supposed to judge somebody, how do I know who is a swine and who's worth what I give and who's not worth? How am I going to know how best to approach a difficult situation where I really want to help my brother with the speck in his eye, even though I might have a log in my own? And I propose that when Jesus says, ask, seek, and knock, that's precisely what he means. Ask him for the insight to know how to approach someone else in a very sensitive topic in a way that they can hear you without thinking or believing that you're actually judging them by bringing this up in the first place. And then in Matthew 7:12, Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Imagine if you were doing something that someone else thought was wrong. How would you want them to approach you? Would you want them to do it in love? Would you want them to do it in grace? Or would you want them to do it with guilt and thumping you over the head with a Bible verse? How you would want somebody to approach you should shape the way you approach other people. And so when you are reproved or you are given instruction or you are given an alternative perspective, you're faced with a choice. Do I just write this person's perspective off? Or if I was in their shoes and they had enough courage to tell me that they have an opposing view and here are their reasons why, I now have to ask, is that legitimate? What would it look like to bring their perspective into my own understanding and begin to reshape the way I think about this? And I saw this happen a little over a year ago. We had a pastor in our community who is black, and he invited several other black pastors and several white pastors and church leaders into his into a community space where he does a lot of ministry in our community, and he talked about his experiences as a black man in the county in which we live, and the numerous times that he was pulled over and told to put his hands up on the front of the steering wheel because he, quote unquote, fit the description of some person that the police were looking for. When the man the police were looking for was 6'4", 240 pounds, and my pastor friend was 5'9", 140 pounds. No way in the world he, quote unquote, fit the description, except for the fact that he was black and he was a man. Now, when he shares what it is like experientially to deal with racist attitudes from those in authority, I know the moment he starts talking, I have nothing to say and everything to learn. That's just the facts. I have never been pulled over because I, quote unquote, fit the description of someone the police were looking for. I have never been treated in a certain way because of the color of my skin. Those are just facts. The fact is, this friend of mine has experienced that. Not once or twice or 10 times, but hundreds of times. And so when he speaks, me, being someone who wants to grow in wisdom and wants to understand the world in which we live, says he is my brother. He, in his blackness, is every bit as valuable in God's kingdom as me in my whiteness. And somewhere in the world of white and black living in the same world, the experiences of both people are needed in order to get closer to the truth. Notice I didn't say to get to the truth, closer to the truth. Neither one of us are women. We are not children. We are not from, another country. Like both of us are from America. So like when we're told that the church consists of people from every tribe and language and people and nation, what that actually means, aside from the fact that it is a global international movement of God, it means that we need those perspectives from all of those different people groups and languages and perspectives and genders and ages and life experiences in order to have a more holistic and a more complete picture of what it means to follow Jesus. Now, I didn't know that I was going to get into all of this as we talk today, but as Jesus is wrapping up his sermon, what he wants us to know is this: building our house on what he's called us to do and what he's called us to do and who he's called us to be is what he means by being a wise person. Do not be like the fool who thinks he or she already knows, that they have nothing left to learn, that the people who point out those things are somehow the enemy or they are attacking our history. When people, quote unquote, attack history, like I've heard it done, saying that in history books, they're going back and challenging that Christopher Columbus wasn't actually a really good idea. It's not our fault that nobody in history books in the last 50 years decided to print Christopher Columbus's actual journal entries from the time that he came to America. Like, that's not our fault. But the fact that somebody now is bringing that to the attention of everyone is also no one's fault. What are we interested in? We're interested in the truth. Is that not pursuing something that is godly, considering that Jesus said he himself is the truth? And guess what? For the life he's called us to live, the last thing we want to do is find ourselves in a place where in order to pursue life, we feel like we have to deny the truth. We don't. We don't have to be afraid of there coming some discovery about something that doesn't align itself with what we already believe. We're eager for more wisdom. We are always eager for more learning, more understanding, deeper insight. And Jesus simply says, I want you to place yourself in the front of that line saying, I'm the first to learn something new. That's all. In fact, that's what I honestly think leadership is a lot about. I don't know a lot about leadership, but one of the things I do know is that leaders, I believe, are simply those who volunteer to be the first in line to have Jesus work on them. That's what I think a leader does. And then he invites other people, showing them, you can do this. You can do what I'm doing. Jesus isn't out here to hurt us or to run us off, but we don't want to be people who insulate ourselves from the truth in order to protect the quote-unquote life that we already have. Jesus says that's the path to foolery. Don't follow that path. Don't build your house on the sand. Always be open to seeing, right? Whoever hears these words of mine and does them. So doing these things is going to continue to deepen and open our ability to find real life and freedom in this world, regardless of what happens around us. Always. This is why it's such good news that Jesus has come, because we will always be bombarded or inundated by things around us that scare us, that make us uncomfortable. And instead of wishing that those things would go away, what we could start doing is asking Jesus to make us more comfortable with being uncomfortable. You ever thought about praying that way? It's kind of scary at first. It's a little counterintuitive, but it's so worth it, because as he does that and as he begins that process with you, you will find life getting so much better in different ways than you ever imagined, but better nonetheless. So that's all I have this week for the podcast. I'm starting to get a little tickle in my throat, so I think that's time for me to stop talking. But I am so thankful for those of you listening in. Thank you to one of my more recent listeners who I think recently anyway left me a rating and a review, really generous and kind words. So thank you to you, reviewer, who left me a rating and review on Apple iTunes. Like I said, we'll wrap up the sermon in the next episode. And I have some ideas for where we're going to go from there. But I hope that this is still an encouragement to you, and you find that just listening to Jesus in His Word is something that's powerful, and that I hope you have a community where you can talk about these things together and put Jesus's teaching into action. So that's all the time we have for this week. I hope you have a fantastic next 7 days, and I will talk to you next time.